So my name's Edmund Brunaghin. I'm a security researcher with Cisco Talos. I've spent about a decade in the security industry. Most of my career before coming to Talos was in security operations. Show of hands, who here works in security operations in some capacity? Yeah, so a few, okay. Of anyone who works in a security operations capacity, whether that's monitoring for intrusion events or doing incident response or anything like that, how many of you have the luxury of being able to statically reverse engineer an unknown binary in your environment? Okay, so a couple. In most of the security operations centers and security operations teams I've worked in, most of the time the team just doesn't have that luxury. So you have a SIM chirp or you have an antivirus alert come in and you have to figure out, what is a specific binary, what does it do, is it malware, what kind of malware is it, what's the risk to my organization, and typically you have a very short period of time to answer those questions before management comes and asks those questions and you have to be able to answer them. So kind of wanted to put this talk together to focus on that, to provide a quick and easy way that you can come across samples in your environment, analyze them, identify functionality associated with those samples without having to statically reverse engineer, go function by function, and analyze code execution flow. There's a lot of different reasons why security operations teams don't typically have that capacity, right? Sometimes they're just not trained in how to use a disassembler or how to use a debugger. And a lot of times they just don't have the time or resources available to be able to statically reverse engineer malware. And that's where dynamic analysis comes in. The name of the talk was AKA Dynamic Malware Analysis for the Overworked Analyst, but it could also be AKA how to avoid having to perform reverse engineering in the first place, because a lot of times it takes a lot of time, and in a lot of cases it's not actually necessary, especially with things like commodity malware. It's very easy to go from, this is a sample that I found in my environment, to, hey, this is what it actually is, this is what it does, this is the risk it poses, and this is the sort of response that I need to take without having to even open it up in a disassembler or a debugger and manually analyze code execution flow. So what this presentation is not. I don't have a single slide with a screenshot of assembly code. So that's not what it's about. It's about not having to actually perform that sort of process on a binary in your environment. It's much easier to be able to, let's say, execute it in a sandbox environment, identify the functionality associated with it, put together an IOC list, and then pivot on that to identify the malware family. And in a lot of cases, an antivirus company or a security researcher has already performed the reverse engineering for you, right? So from a security operations perspective, you can very quickly answer the questions you need to answer without having to actually perform that process yourself. So what are we going to cover today? Want to go over how to build kind of a portable malware analysis lab. So a quick and easy lab that you can stand up in an environment that will enable you to perform that dynamic analysis of samples you may come across. I also want to talk about open source intelligence, right? Being able to leverage all of the great work that the entire security industry is doing on a regular basis, because it can save you a lot of time, it can save you a lot of resources, and at the end of the day, you're able to answer the questions you need to answer very, very quickly, because that's what it's all about. When you're trying to figure out, do I need to initiate incident response and what does that incident response needs to look like, being able to avoid statically analyzing a sample and being able to go straight to, hey, we know all about this because there's already been a dossier released on it is very, very powerful. And then I want to talk about a repeatable process. I'm going to go over some quick and easy tools that you can stand up in your analysis environment to help you quickly identify what a particular malware sample is capable of doing, and then that provides you, once again, information you can pivot on to positively identify if it's a known malware family, what functionality is available, and what it's designed for, what impact could it have in your environment so you can respond accordingly, right? So let's get started. Let's talk about malware analysis labs, right? When you're building out a malware analysis lab, the first thing you need to do is identify what your requirements are. So I just kind of put a list together of some of the requirements I have when I'm putting together a malware analysis lab, right? I need to be able to facilitate analyzing malware that targets multiple platforms, multiple versions of Windows, OS X, Linux, things of that nature. I also need to be able to anonymize C2 traffic. One of the things that you'll see is when a malware author, especially in more targeted attacks, sends malware into your environment, whether it's phishing or through the use of malvertising campaigns, things like that, they're going to notice if they start getting a lot of C2 and it looks like you've found their malware. So being able to transparently route all of the traffic from my analysis lab through Tor is essential. Also needs to be reasonably safe from contamination, right? You don't want to just throw this into your production, server network and start analyzing and detonating malware samples, because that could get nasty quickly depending on the type of malware it is, especially, given some of the worm activity we've seen this year. Also need to be able to perform passive analysis of network traffic, right? So not necessarily running, TCP dump or Wireshark on the system that I'm, detonating malware samples on, but being able to do that off box. Because in a lot of cases, malware will check for the existence of processes that are used for common analysis tasks. And then I need to be able to simulate C2 communications. And I'll go into some tools that facilitate that in a little bit. But I also needed it to be a little bit more versatile. So maybe I don't just want to analyze malware. Maybe I also want to, stand up, additional virtual machines or additional systems that I can use for other purposes, whether that's penetration testing, CTF activity, things like that. So once you identified your requirements, one of the most vital answers or questions that you need to answer is whether or not you go bare metal or virtual, right? It's a question that's been asked by pretty much every malware analyst ever, right? To VM or not to VM. There's some pros and cons to both sides, right? So with virtual environments, they're really flexible. You can simulate a lot of complex network topology configurations without having to buy a bunch of blinky lights or a bunch of gear. It's also recoverable, right? You can take snapshots, and you should definitely take snapshots as quickly as possible, all the time. So that when you are analyzing a particular malware sample, you can execute it multiple times and have different sets of snapshots associated with what you're doing with the particular sample. It's also pretty cheap, right? Once again, you don't have to buy a bunch of gear, so you can do it on relatively simple hardware, even a laptop in a lot of cases. But there are cons associated with it, right? A lot of malware is designed to detect whether or not it's being executed in a virtual environment, and it'll behave differently than if it's in bare metal. Anti-sandbox techniques are very, very common nowadays. Physical, it's secure. You don't have to worry about somebody throwing you an O-day for your hypervisor or something, though if you came across that, that would be excellent because those aren't cheap. Also evasion, right? Malware's never going to detect it's running in a virtual environment or sandbox because it's not. And then it'll keep your house warm during the winter. So that's some of the pros associated with physical systems. For me, here's some of the lab components that I typically will use or recommend. So, a decent system. One of the most important things is storage capacity, right? When you're taking snapshots and you have multiple VMs, you're going to run into storage issues. So that's really the most important thing I found. CPUs, RAM, that's cheap nowadays, but finding, like, let's say a laptop with enough storage to facilitate, several VMs with multiple trees of snapshots, that gets expensive quickly. Also recommend a hardware firewall just to make sure that you're in a controlled environment and that you don't have to risk any sort of cross-contamination when you're actively, detonating and running malware in your lab. From a guest systems perspective, it just depends. For me, I typically try to run a bunch of different versions of the Windows operating system as well as OS X. A couple optional but recommended, so Remnix is super useful for analyzing malware, especially when it comes to things like passive network inspection and being able to log a lot of the traffic, a lot of built-in tools, which I'll go over in a little bit. IPFire I like to use. It's like a UTM, but it's really, really simple to deploy, and I like to stand that up because it has a snort IDS process that you can enable. It also has a Tor SOX proxy that you can enable, so if you're sending traffic through this to exit your environment, it can basically route that through Tor if you can SOXify your applications. And then also OnionPi is something that I came across a little bit after I initially put my lab together, but it's super useful. You can basically take a Raspberry Pi, give it two network interfaces. One of them in my configuration is wireless and the other one's wired, but you can basically stand it up so that it's an AP that broadcasts in your environment, connect your system that you're using for analysis up to it, and it will route all the traffic through itself through Tor. So completely transparent to whatever physical network you're actually connected to. So why do I recommend IPFire? Super simple to deploy, and it's really great to use as kind of a gateway between your malware analysis network and the outside world. So you can do transparent network inspection, you can run intrusion detection rule set, and you can gather a lot of log data, you can TCP dump from it, and you can see pretty much everything that the system you're using to analyze malware is doing at any given time. Once again, it has an optional Tor routing package that you can deploy straight from within IPFire. That's really super simple to set up. Takes about 2 minutes. And then you have a SOCKS proxy that'll just send all your traffic through Tor. Just a note, if you do take this sort of approach, applications that aren't SOCKS or aren't proxy aware, and then a lot of malware may not necessarily use your SOCKS proxy. So it's important that you make sure that you're using applications that are proxy aware if you do this, or SOCKSify them or something like that, which is kind of why I started recommending OnionPi over IPFire just from a Tor routing perspective, because it's completely transparent to your analysis lab. It's super simple to deploy. Takes about 30 minutes to set up, and then once you've got it set up, you plug its physical interface into your network, and then it's got a secondary Wi-Fi interface that functions as an AP. When you want to analyze malware, connect up to the AP, and all your traffic gets routed through Tor. So super easy, super flexible. You can simply, I was using my Raspberry Pi as a RetroPi, and this is super simple. You just pop another SD card into your Raspberry Pi, and all of a sudden you have an OnionPi. So from a lab network topology setup, one of the things I like to do is I like to stand up multiple virtual network interfaces within whatever hypervisor I happen to be using. And so one of those network interfaces will connect to the outside world. So whatever network connection your physical host system is connected to, and that's what facilitates communication out of your analysis environment. And then you've got a secondary virtual network interface that's kind of a private network. And then I deploy my IPFire, as you can see right here, that basically bridges the two networks. So it facilitates communications from the internal private-only network to the outside world and through my OnionPi. And then within your analysis network, that private network, you can deploy VMs as needed to perform the analysis, whatever target operating system malware is trying to execute in. You can also deploy any tool set that you need to analyze the malware if you're doing passive analysis, things like that. So I mentioned Remnix earlier. I'm an avid fan of Remnix because it's super useful for performing a lot of different off-box analysis. So two of the tools that I specifically like in Remnix is INetSim and FakeDNS. So the idea here is that you take, let's say, a Windows VM that you're detonating malware in, and you point your DNS server and gateway over to your Remnix VM. Well, by deploying INetSim and FakeDNS within Remnix, you can have a system that always responds to DNS requests from whatever system you're analyzing malware in, and it says, oh, you want to go to google.com, for instance. Well, that's me. And so you can very, very quickly and easily see all of the DNS requests that malware is making in your analysis environment. And INetSim is great because when you combine it with FakeDNS, let's say it wants to stand up an HTTP connection to perform command and control communications. Well, INetSim basically simulates a bunch of different network services in your analysis environment. So you've got DNS that says, oh yeah, you want to go to Google? Well, that's me. And then it'll also facilitate an HTTP handshake. So you can play with command and control communications that malware is making. You can simulate responses that malware may want to see to get further into the C2 communications process. Not only that, but even if you're not doing active network analysis with Remnix, there's a lot of other very, very useful tools for document analysis, deobfuscating JavaScript, and things that you'll commonly do if you're in SecOps and you're analyzing threats that may be seen within your environment. So a couple of tools that I use on the system that I'm actually detonating malware in. I use RegShot, and I'll go into that in a little bit. Capture Bat's older. It doesn't run on 64-bit operating systems, but if you're doing 32-bit analysis, it's super helpful. Process Hacker is really handy for quickly identifying what malware is doing in real time on a system. Sysinternal Suite, obviously, there's a ton of great utilities that you can use for analyzing samples in your environment. And then Fiddler and HTTP proxies are super useful for quickly identifying the types of HTTP communications malware may be doing. So the idea is, as I mentioned, set a static IP on the analysis machine that you're using and set your gateway and DNS over to your Remnix box so you can analyze quickly the DNS communications as well as what sorts of network services the malware is trying to consume from what would be the attacker's command and control server. And then you turn up Wireshark or TCP dump on Remnix as well, and you can see from a PCAP perspective everything that the system's doing. And then send syslogs over to a system where you can review them after you've detonated your malware. So if you're running Snort on your IPFire UTM or within Remnix, you just send your syslog out somewhere that you can review it after the fact. So I mentioned RegShot. RegShot's super useful for quickly taking a snapshot of the registry on a Windows system, as well as indexing the contents of a directory structure. And so the idea is that you do this before you execute malware, and then you do it again after you execute malware, and it'll produce a nice report that shows you everything that's changed from a registry perspective, as well as anything that's changed within the directory contents of the hard drive of whatever directory that you suggest. I typically will start out just indexing the entire hard drive and then kind of pinpoint from there where I happen to see malware starting to write. But it'll give you a nice, handy report so you can quickly identify, what's changed. And based on the contents of new registry keys or new files that are created or new paths that are touched, a lot of times you can take those IOCs and you can pivot on those. So you spend 5 minutes executing a malware sample, and you may be able to identify what the malware family is, what its capabilities are, and what risk it poses to your organization. So Process Hacker it's kind of like Task Manager on steroids. It's super useful for quickly identifying, what malware is writing to, any sort of network connections that get created by the malware while it's executing, et cetera. And it's very useful from a visual perspective. So while you're analyzing a particular malware sample, you can have this up and it color codes changes to the system, and you can very, very quickly identify those in real time before you even go back and review the log data that you're generating with RegShot and other utilities later. So this is just an example of all of the network connections that are being seen on a specific VM that I was running. And you can see it's color-coded. It's really intuitive and really easy to quickly identify changes in real time on a system. And then you can also see files that are written to disk in real time as well. So having that just right in front of you is kind of a single pane of glass into what's going on a system. Obviously, you'll have historical log data later when you're running your RegShot reports and stuff like that, but if you see something that pops up in Process Hacker while you're executing malware, you can quickly start to search on those IOCs, and you may not even need to review log data later. Like I mentioned, it's all about trying to avoid expending additional resources if they're not necessarily required in a security operations environment. Most of the teams that I've been on have been overworked and understaffed, so being able to perform this process quickly in an operational environment is essential. And then Process Monitor is another good utility for monitoring all of the different changes on a Windows system. It can be very, very verbose, so one of the things that they provide is kind of a filtering functionality, so you can deploy filters that will only show you things that you may be interested in. And this requires kind of a balancing act, right? You don't want a whole lot of extra noise, but if you start to get too aggressive with your filtering, you may miss things that you actually need to be paying attention to. So there's a lot of filters that you can find on the interwebs, and you can download them, import them into Process Monitor. There's a lot of use cases that have already been created, but it keeps you from having to potentially analyze millions of lines of changes when you really maybe only need to be concerned with a few thousand. All about speeding that process up. So I mentioned FakeDNS earlier. That's that process that you run on Remnix, and you point your DNS server on your Windows environment to your Remnix VM or whatever Linux system you may be using. You can deploy this package on any number of Linux environments, but this is kind of what it looks like when you're executing a process on your Windows VM and it's making DNS requests. So it's real quick, real easy way to very, very quickly identify what malware may be requesting from a domain resolution perspective. It's all about putting the information in front of you in least convoluted of a way as possible so that you can quickly perform that analysis. So INetSim is great because it allows you to simulate network services within your analysis environment. So you can simulate IRC servers, you can simulate web servers, you can simulate SMTP servers, you can simulate pretty much anything that malware might typically use for command and control. And that's really powerful because you can also use INetSim and write response information or response instructions within Remnix. So you can facilitate getting further into that command and control traffic process. So you can simulate responses based on what you're finding about what the malware is expecting to receive from command and control and get more information. But you typically don't necessarily need to do that if you're just performing malware identification. And this is kind of what it looks like when you've got INetSim running and you analyze a malware sample that uses HTTP requests for command and control. You can very quickly see what URIs are being requested and things of that nature. Also, Wireshark, if you don't use Wireshark, you probably want to get familiar with it. One of the most powerful things that I find is the ability to export objects. So if you do have a malware sample that's making use of HTTP for additional stage downloads or command and control or things like that, deployment of additional modules, you can very quickly export those HTTP objects out once you've created your PCAP, and you can analyze those as well. So anytime you're analyzing malware in a virtual environment, you're going to run into situations where the malware simply won't do what you would expect it to do. It may do nothing at all. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. Malware authors have taken a lot of steps to evade automated analysis environments, so like sandboxes and things like that. You know, they'll profile the system. They'll look for devices that are associated with VMware, VirtualBox, or parallels. They'll check for debugger. They'll look at system time. They'll look at, you know, the number of cores in your system. They'll look for mouse movements. They'll look for a lot of different activity to try to identify whether they're being executed, you know, within a legitimate system that maybe an end user is using versus just being pushed into a sandbox and detonated for the creation of like a cuckoo report. A lot of times you'll see sleep patterns that are baked into a lot of the different malware that we see in the wild. So, you know, you may not be able to just run it for 5 minutes and expect it to actually kick into the malicious activity that you would expect. You may have to run it for longer. And in some cases, it may just be easier to stand up bare metal and execute it there. So if you're having a hard time trying to identify, you know, what sort of evasion is this malware doing? What's it looking for? What's it triggering on? Is it looking for the existence of different applications installed, processes running? You know, at the end of the day, it may be easier just to run it in bare metal and not even worry about it. So there's a couple things that you can do. There's some plugins you can use within like Ollie Debug that will hide the presence of a debugger. Don't use VM drivers. So I know a lot of people, it's very, very convenient to be able to have things like copy paste and directory sharing within, let's say, VMware. But whenever you install the guest utilities that facilitate that sort of activity, you're basically putting a lot of artifacts on the system that make it very, very obvious that it's running in a virtual environment. So, you know, device drivers get installed, things like that. I find it's best just not to install any sort of like guest additions or tools that allow you to copy paste, just deal with it, right? Also, there's applications you can use to simulate mouse movements. There's also open source code that you can use that will make it look like your mouse is moving around the screen, because there are malware families that do check for that. Also, make sure your VM has more than one core. So one of the things that we've seen with certain malware is that if you are executing in a system that only has one core, they assume that most conventional commercial PCs nowadays have more than one core, right? Who's got a laptop or desktop with less than 2 cores? Not very many people. So they know that it's common that when you're trying to conserve resources, you deploy VMs for analysis with the least amount of resources necessary. So if malware detects less than 2 cores, it may not run. Also, snapshot after a few hours of simulated activity. So one thing that malware may do is it may look for the presence of documents within the My Documents folder, or internet browsing cache, or things like that to show that the system's been in use recently, right? If you just deploy a fresh VM and don't do anything on it, it doesn't look like it's a legitimate system that a malware author may want to infect. Also, once again, be patient, and you may have to go bare metal if, you know, just based on time. You could spend time analyzing evasion, analyzing anti-sandbox techniques, but if you're in a security operations environment and you just need answers quickly, you may just deploy bare metal and do that. So finding malware samples, if you're interested in getting more acquainted with the dynamic analysis process, you can get them all over the place. There's no shortage of malware across the internet nowadays. Twitter is great for finding IOCs, correlating IOCs, and then identifying new samples. You know, people tag malware IOCs with hashtags based on the malware family, so like TrickBot or Globe Imposter or something like that. You just search Twitter and you're going to come up with samples. There's no shortage. Also, you can use VirusTotal VTI for Yara hunting if there's a specific malware family that you're looking to get more samples for. When in doubt, right, open your spam folder. People are definitely spamming malware on a regular basis. Sign up for as much junk as you can with a throwaway account. You may need to deploy your own email service because Gmail will filter spam pretty well. So if you're just looking for raw samples, you may need to stand up a domain, set up an email, and then just start spamming that out on whatever list you can. And then MHN, Modern Honeypot Network, is really great for quickly deploying different sorts of honeypots. So you can deploy WordPress honeypots, things like that, to quickly identify what attackers are dropping or what attackers are uploading to vulnerable servers in real time. So, right, you've got malware in your environment, you've done some dynamic analysis, and you're trying to figure out what you're actually looking at. You've got some IOC data because you executed malware, and you've got network communications that malware is making. You've got registry entries that are being created, WMI registration that's taking place. You've got a list of IOC, so what do you do with it? Well, open source intelligence is great for being able to go from, I have a list of IOCs, to this is the malware that I'm actually looking at, and here's a technical write-up of all the functionality associated with it. And when I say OSINT, or open source intelligence, I'm not talking about doxing people. I'm talking about the threat intelligence that's being generated on a daily basis by the entire security community. And it's great because it's one of the best ways to get samples, and you can quickly pivot on IOCs that you may see in your environment to go from unknown binary to being able to answer all the questions that you need to answer very, very quickly when your SIM chirps or your AV solution chirps or something like that. And also, being able to work with the community is great, right? Everyone being able to put as much IOC data, as much analysis data out into the public space is great because it saves everyone time. It raises the bar for the entire community, and that's one of the things that we always try to do. So just some examples of some good open source intelligence resources that are out there that are available for use. Whois data is great. Domain Tools is a paid service, but I highly recommend it for being able to perform like historic whois reconnaissance, being able to do reverse whois, being able to search off of different IOC data about a domain registrant is super helpful when it comes to being able to pivot and identify the scope of a malware campaign that you may see in your environment. Also, IP void is great if you've only got an IP address and you're trying to figure out, has it been seen? Is it bad? Is it good? What do various sources know about it? VirusTotal is super helpful. One of the things you'll find if you come across a hash in your environment is if you throw it into VirusTotal, the community is great about putting comments and tagging samples with the configuration that a malware sample may be programmed to use. That'll include things like command and control servers. A lot of times you'll see the actual malware family itself tagged, and that can be very helpful when it comes to identifying what you're actually looking at from a malware sample perspective. Also, security blogs, there's a ton of them out there, and it's good because there's a lot of great information that's being put into the public space on a very, very regular basis. A lot of researchers are coming across malware in the wild, analyzing it, ripping it apart, and then putting very, very comprehensive write-ups out. And they can be very helpful for a SecOps team or a security analyst if you're trying to quickly analyze something that you've come across. Also, URL void is super helpful as well. URL query is another great example because you can quickly visualize all of the different requests that are made and all of the different response data associated with HTTP communication. So if you have a domain that you've come across, you've seen malware, reach out to it, and you want to get more information, you throw the URL into urlquery.net, and you can get a lot of good information very, very quickly about that. Right, so correlating IOCs to identify malware. Data pivoting. Pivoting is very, very essential. So being able to go from rando IOCX to this is everything that the world knows about a malware family is super useful. And you can pivot off of a lot of different data. You can pivot off of hashes. You can pivot off of domains, C2 IP addresses, domain registrant information. A lot of things like that. You can also pivot off of the URI structure of command and control. Traffic. So in a lot of commodity malware, they don't change that very, very often, and you can see command and control URI requests go out, and you can just basically take the path that's used and quickly identify the sort of malware. So things like Pony and H1N1, they don't change the URI structure all that frequently from what I've seen just off of samples in the wild. File names can be searched. That's not as accurate because obviously file names aren't a hash, but they can at least help in certain situations where you're just not coming up with a lot of useful data elsewhere. So just some examples. I've gone over a few of them. So I mentioned Votrak, Pony. They've been known to use static URI structures. You'll see them rotate occasionally, but it doesn't happen that often. It's not like every sample is using a completely different URI structure. So just by throwing it into Google, you can very, very quickly go from random URI pattern to, oh, someone's seen this, they've identified the malware family, and there's extensive write-ups about it. Just a quick and dirty analysis process. I've kind of gone through some of this already, but just to kind of put it all together and bring it back to what this process actually looks like when you've got a malware sample that you need to analyze in your environment, right? So first you'll start up your Remnix VM and you'll launch those two utilities I mentioned earlier, INetSim, FakeDNS. You'll probably want to stand up a packet capture program of some sort, whatever your PCAP collection utility of choice is, Wireshark, TCP dump. And then you want to start your analysis VM. So that would be let's say the Windows VM that you're actually going to execute malware in for analysis. First things first, take a fresh snapshot. I can't stress enough that snapshots are your friend. Take them often, take them as much as you can. Because I have had several situations where I just haven't thought about it, and I've like set up some utilities and I've done some tweaking, and then I just didn't take a snapshot, and then I went to execute some malware, and then when I went to revert snapshot, it was like, oh, well, there goes 4 hours of work. Also set your local DNS and gateway to point to Remnix so that you can actually be able to collect and analyze those DNS requests. You can create the PCAPs, and you can simulate that C2 traffic using INetSim. And then test your DNS just to make sure your tools are executing properly. Make a DNS request out, ping Google or something like that, and you'll see it in Remnix. You'll see the DNS request, you'll see the actual GET request over HTTP, and that's how you know your tools are working, so you don't waste time and come to find out that you're not actually generating log data after you've been executing malware for 10, 15 minutes. So then you'll set up your analysis VM. So you'll want to start up process monitor. There's some batch files that you can use to basically, a lot of times malware will write to the temp directory or to other common directories within the Windows file system, and you can basically loop in Windows command line that'll basically say, okay, anytime a file gets dropped into this directory, copy it out of that directory into a staging directory that you can use to look at it later, because a lot of times what you'll see with malware is that they'll drop into temp, execute, and then clean temp up, so it happens very, very quickly, and by having this loop over the temp directory, you can make sure that you can grab a copy of it before it gets deleted later on. Also, startup process hacker, right? You want to know what malware is doing in real time. Even though you're generating logs, if you can see something very, very quickly while you're executing the malware, it's super helpful. And then start up RegShot. You want to do RegShot after some of these other utilities because they can be somewhat noisy, and it'll make your report look a lot nastier, and you'll have to go through a lot more false positives in your RegShot report if you do that first and then start kicking off these other processes. And then you'll want to save the RegShot report that you generate before you execute malware into a directory that's not likely to be overwritten. So if you're analyzing, let's say, ransomware, or you don't know what you're analyzing yet, you don't want to store this in a location that is just going to be overwritten and encrypted. And then if you're on 32-bit Windows system, capture that. But typically, if you're using a 64-bit analysis platform, it's not applicable. So once you have your initial RegShot report set up, and you're capturing data, and you've got Remnix set up, and your VM's pointed to it, you'll want to actually execute the malware. So you'll start process monitor, and you'll start capturing system activity. You can deploy any filters that you need to, like I mentioned earlier. You want to execute the malware within the virtual environment, and then you'll want to monitor the activity. Just let it run for a little bit, and then you'll be able to, you may have a visual indication, like if it's ransomware, right, that's going to be in your face. When ransomware kicks off, it's going to display a ransom note that gives you instructions for how to pay the ransom demand to decrypt your files, and you'll know right then and there that, yeah, it's probably okay to go ahead and terminate execution. Other types of malware may be less in your face as far as like giving you a visual indication that malware is actually executing properly, so you may just need to give it some time and then look and see. So, you'll want to execute a second RegShot capture. That creates your after report. So you have a before report and you have an after report, and then you can basically diff the two and compare what changes have been made. You'll want to export any sort of event logs from within Windows that you may have. And you want to export all the things, so all the reports that you've created using these utilities, as well as your FakeDNS and INetSim reports. And at that point, you have a lot of data that you can quickly analyze to try to put together that IOC list that I mentioned earlier that you pivot off of to positively identify the malware itself. So just some key takeaways. You know, malware analysis labs aren't expensive. Hardware costs have come down significantly over the past several years. Make sure you have storage. Make sure you have more storage than you think you'll need, because snapshots get costly very quickly. You know, you can have several gigs per snapshot, depending on what you've done on the system from the time you've taken your last snapshot to when you take your next one. And make sure you have your setup beforehand. So the whole idea behind this is to try to give a very inexpensive, quick, and easy process that security operations teams can use in their environments to very quickly analyze malware-related events that they may come across, alerts that they may see in their environment. But it's very important that you set all of this stuff up before you actually need it, because it takes a little while to get all the way set up, to get all of your tools configured the way that you like them, to stand up the virtual environment, to stand up all the VMs that you need. So making sure that you have those already available when you need them is essential to being able to make this a quick process. And in many cases, you can identify malware and its capabilities without necessarily even running it. You can take a hash and throw it into VirusTotal, or throw it into a Google search and look at different sorts of sandbox reports, hybrid analysis, malware. There's a lot of different reports that you can get just by throwing a file hash into Google. And it can save you a lot of time, because you may be able to put together the IOCs that allow you to identify the malware and its capabilities without ever even needing it detonated. In the case that you do, this process is super useful for providing a quick and dirty way to be able to obtain and answer a lot of questions and obtain a lot of information about malware in your environment. Open source data is your friend, right? No need to reinvent the wheel. No need to do all of this work yourself if someone else has already done it and has been helpful enough to actually release it to the world. And then if all else fails, just run the malware, capture its activity. You'll be able to put together at least some sort of a list of IOC data related to that malware, and then use that to identify it and its associated characteristics. And you may be able to identify its characteristics right away just based on what you observe in your analysis lab. And so with that, if anybody has any questions, I'll take them now. I appreciate it.